The worn fabric caught on the rough edge of the wooden chair as Eleanor Hartwell smoothed her hands over the faded rose pattern of her dress. The same dress she had mended 3 times in the past year. The same dress her mother had worn before her illness took everything they had. She had received the invitation to Lady Catherine's afternoon tea that morning, delivered by a boy who looked at her cottage with barely concealed pity. And she had almost declined, knowing full well that every woman there would be draped in silks and jewels, while she arrived in cotton that had seen better days. But something deep within her, perhaps the ghost of her mother's voice, reminding her that dignity was not found in fabric, but in bearing, had compelled her to accept, to pin up her dark hair with the last ivory comb she owned, and to walk the 3 miles to the manor house, with her head held high despite the holes in her shoes. The afternoon sun cast golden shadows across the grand estate as Eleanor approached, her heart hammering against her ribs with each step. She could see them through the tall windows. The ladies of society gathered like exotic birds in a gilded cage, their laughter floating out on the summer breeze. She almost turned back then, almost let fear and shame guide her feet toward home. But she thought of her mother again, of the pride in her eyes even when they had nothing, and she pushed forward. The butler who answered the door looked her up and down with an expression that made her feel smaller than she already did, but he stepped aside nevertheless, and Eleanor entered a world that felt impossibly distant from her own. Lady Catherine greeted her with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, the kind of smile that spoke of duty rather than warmth, and guided her to a chair positioned slightly apart from the others. Eleanor sat carefully, aware of every thread, every patch, every sign of her poverty that her dress betrayed. The other women cast glances in her direction, some curious, some condescending, and she heard the whispered words that were not quite whispered enough. Poor dear, how unfortunate. What was Catherine thinking, inviting her? Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she kept her gaze steady, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. She had weathered worse storms than this, had held her mother's hand as she drew her last breath, had sold everything of value to pay the debts her father's gambling had left behind, and she would not break under the weight of their judgment. If you believe in kindness, in the power of second chances, in the beauty of dignity even in the face of hardship, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to Duchess of Secrets. Your support means the world, and helps us continue bringing you stories that touch the soul. Then the room fell silent, and Eleanor looked up to see him. The Duke of Ashford stood in the doorway, tall and imposing in his perfectly tailored coat, his dark eyes scanning the room with an intensity that made the air feel heavy. Eleanor had heard of him, everyone had. The war hero who had returned from the continent with medals and scars, the man who could have any woman in England but had shown interest in none. Lady Catherine rose immediately, her face flushed with excitement, and the other women followed suit, each one straightening their posture, adjusting their gowns, preparing to catch his attention. Eleanor remained seated, not out of disrespect, but because she knew she had nothing to offer a man like him. No fortune, no connections, no beauty enhanced by expensive fabrics and precious stones. His gaze found her anyway. Across the room filled with peacock-proud women, his eyes locked onto hers, and Eleanor felt something shift in the air between them, something she could not name but could feel in the depths of her chest. He crossed the room with purpose, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor, and every head turned to follow his path. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as he stopped directly in front of her, and she realized with a mixture of terror and confusion that he was looking at her, as though she were the only person in the room. He extended his hand, and his voice when he spoke was deep and warm, completely at odds with the stern expression the gossips always described. "Miss Hartwell, I believe," he said, and Eleanor could only nod, her voice trapped somewhere between her heart and her throat. He asked if he might sit with her, and Eleanor was certain she must be dreaming, certain that any moment she would wake in her small cottage, and find this was nothing but fantasy. But his hand was warm and solid when she took it, and he settled into the chair beside her, with a naturalness that suggested he had intended to do so all along. The other women stared with barely concealed shock and envy, and Lady Catherine looked as though she might faint from the scandal of it all. The Duke seemed utterly unbothered by the commotion his choice had caused. Instead, he turned to Eleanor and began to speak to her as though they were old friends, asking about her thoughts on the gardens, on the unseasonably warm weather, on the book he had noticed tucked into her worn cloth bag. Eleanor found herself responding, her initial fear giving way to something warmer as she realized he was genuinely listening to her answers, his attention never wavering, his questions thoughtful and kind. He did not ask about her circumstances, did not pity her poverty, did not treat her as a charity case to be managed. He spoke to her as an equal, and Eleanor felt something inside her begin to unfurl, like a flower long denied sunlight. She forgot about her dress, forgot about the whispers, forgot about everything except the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she said something that amused him, the way his voice softened when he spoke of his sister, the way he listened with his whole attention. When she mentioned her love of literature, hours passed like minutes, and the afternoon tea became irrelevant background noise to their conversation. Eleanor learned that he had loved and lost during the war, that he had returned to England feeling disconnected from the society that celebrated him, that he found most social gatherings exhausting performances, where everyone wore masks of propriety. She shared her own losses, the death of her mother, the betrayal of friends who had disappeared when her father's debts came to light, the strange freedom she had found in poverty, how losing everything had taught her what truly mattered. He listened to all of it without judgment, without the pity she had grown to despise, and when he looked at her, she felt seen in a way she had not felt seen in years. As the sun began to set and the other guests prepared to depart, the Duke rose and offered Eleanor his hand once more. He asked if he might call on her, and the room went silent again, every ear straining to hear her response. Eleanor hesitated, not because she did not wish to see him again, but because she needed him to understand what he was asking, what it would mean to associate himself with someone of her standing. She spoke quietly, reminding him that she had no fortune, no family name to recommend her, nothing but the clothes on her back and the books on her shelf. His response was immediate and firm. He told her that he had spent the last 3 months searching for her, that he had seen her once in the village, helping an elderly woman whose cart had overturned, that he had watched her give away her own bread to hungry children without a second thought, that he had asked every person who would listen about the woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, who seemed to shine with a light that had nothing to do with wealth or status. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as he continued, his voice steady and sure. He said that he had attended every social gathering for weeks hoping to find her, that he had finally learned her name and her story, and had convinced Lady Catherine to invite her to this tea with the promise of a generous donation to her favourite charity. He confessed that he had fallen in love with her kindness, her strength, her grace under circumstances that would have broken lesser souls, and that her old dress was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen because she wore it. With dignity and pride, Eleanor could barely breathe as he pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it, to reveal a ring that caught the fading sunlight and sent rainbow fractals dancing across the walls. He did not ask her to marry him then, not in front of the gaping audience, but he asked for permission to court her properly, to show her that his intentions were honorable and true. Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw no deception, no ulterior motive, only honesty and hope and something that looked remarkably like love. She said yes, her voice barely above a whisper, and the Duke smiled with such genuine joy that Eleanor felt her own heart swell in response. He escorted her out of the manor house as the other women watched in stunned silence, and he helped her into his carriage despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of walking home. During the ride to her cottage, he told her more about himself, about his dreams for the future, about his desire to use his position and wealth to help those who needed it most. Eleanor shared her own hopes. The school she wanted to open for children who could not afford education. The lending library she dreamed of establishing in the village. He listened to every word, his face illuminated with enthusiasm, and he promised to help her make those dreams reality. When they arrived at her modest home, he walked her to the door and kissed her hand, with a reverence that made her feel like the most precious thing in the world. If this story has touched your heart, if you believe that love sees beyond material wealth, that true nobility is found in character rather than title, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and let us know in the comments how this story made you feel. Your engagement helps us continue creating content that celebrates the power of authentic human connection. The weeks that followed were like living in a dream Eleanor never wanted to wake from. The Duke courted her with patience and respect, taking her on long walks through the countryside, bringing her books he thought she would enjoy, introducing her to his sister who welcomed Eleanor with open arms and genuine affection. He never once made her feel ashamed of her circumstances, and when he finally did propose, on a hillside overlooking the valley where wildflowers bloomed in riotous color, Eleanor said yes with her whole heart. Society was scandalized, of course. The gossips worked themselves into a frenzy over the Duke, who had chosen a pauper over princesses. But Eleanor discovered that she did not care what they thought because she had found something infinitely more valuable than their approval. Please leave a comment sharing what this story meant to you, and tell us about a time when someone saw your true worth beyond external circumstances. On their wedding day, Eleanor wore a dress of the finest silk, a gift from the Duke's sister, but she carried in her pocket a piece of fabric cut from her old, rose-patterned dress, a reminder of where she had come from and what she had learned. As she walked down the aisle toward the man who had seen her worth, when she wore her oldest dress, who had looked past poverty to find the richness of her spirit, Eleanor understood that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin not with grandeur, but with authenticity, not with what we present to the world, but with who we truly are beneath it all. And as the Duke took her hand and promised to love her forever, Eleanor knew that she had found not just a husband, but a partner, who understood that the most valuable treasures in life cannot be bought, cannot be worn, cannot be displayed for others to admire, but can only be felt in the quiet moments between two souls who recognize each other as home.